From Baroness Sophie Buxhoveden's book Left Behind, 14 Months in Siberia During the Revolution, December 1917 through February 1919, and Alexei Volkov's book Memories of Alexei Volkov, Personal Valet to Tsarina Alexandra, 1910 through 1918, we learn about the life of one member of the Imperial Russian household that did not survive, Countess Anastasia Vasilyevna Hendrikova. Countess Anastasia Vasilyevna Hendrikova was born in 1887 and nicknamed Nastenka by the imperial family. She was the daughter of Count Vassili Alexandrovich Hendrikov, Grand Master of Ceremonies of the Imperial Court, and his wife, Princess Sophia Petrovna Gagarine. She was a descendant of the sister of Catherine I of Russia, the wife of Peter the Great. She was also a niece to one of the former court physicians, and we know how important medicine was to the Tsarina with her sick Tsarevich. Although Anastasia Vasilyevna was born into the nobility, she was very simple in her way of life. Her family lived in an apartment in Moscow, and from early youth she dressed very modestly, even old-fashioned, and unlike most noble girls, never participated in balls. Such modesty was attractive to Empress Alexandra, who shied away from the pomp, pettiness, and gossip of Russian imperial court. Nastenka was appointed a lady-in-waiting in 1910. She acted as a sort of unofficial governess to the four Grand Duchesses. She seems to have been closer to the little pair, Grand Duchesses Maria and Anastasia, than Grand Duchesses Olga and Tatiana. Why is that? In 1910, Grand Duchess Olga was 15, and Grand Duchess Tatiana was 13. In all her photos with Nastenka, Olga appears to be crossing her arms. Grand Duchess Olga may have been getting a little too old for a governess, but perhaps that was the point. Of her sisters, Olga had the firmest grasp of geopolitics. She could have formed a rival court against her mother, the possibility of which was raised in February 1916, when society hostess Maria Pavlovna the elder's son, Grand Duke Boris Vladimirovich, sent a marriage proposal to Empress Alexandra for Olga. The proposal was so offensive, Empress Alexandra cried over it. The Empress was disgusted, not least due to Grand Duke Boris's advanced age. He was 18 years, Grand Duchess Olga's senior. At the time, Grand Duke Boris was leading a guards regiment of Ataman Cossacks, and Grand Duchess Olga was working as a Red Cross nurse. A cousin of her father, Boris's parents were very wealthy and lived in the luxurious Vladimir Palace of St. Petersburg. Boris's father was a brother of Tsar Alexander III of Russia, making him a first cousin to Grand Duchess Olga, once removed. His mother, Maria Pavlovna, one of the greatest hostesses of Russian society and an almost polar opposite to the religious, introverted empress. Boris was more extroverted than his siblings and his mother's favorite. Like Olga, Boris spoke English, and at age 18, upon coming of age, he received from his father a plot of land at Tsarskoye Selo on the eastern bank of the Kolonitsky Pond, near the Moskovskaya Gate. So he and the Grand Duchesses were neighbors. There, in 1895, the Grand Duke built his own residence in the style of an English country house. All the materials were imported from England, and the construction was finished in less than a year. The estate, named Wolf Garden, comprised a cottage, coach house, stables, and small tea house, which was used for entertaining. The interiors were designed by Maples, with everything imported from England. To complement the British atmosphere, the servants were hired from England, including a British butler. Boris lived in Wolf Garden all year round while still serving in the army. The property was run as a modern farm, and in 1899 a small house was added for the servants. In 1896, during the coronation ceremonies of Tsar Nicholas II, Boris flirted with Crown Princess Maria of Romania, who was his first cousin and already married. The next year, he visited her in Bucharest, fueling more rumors. She said he had an attractive, rather husky voice, kind eyes, and humorous smile, which crinkled his forehead into unexpected lines. Not exactly handsome, he had nevertheless great charm. The Grand Duke was also entangled with a Mademoiselle Demidov. He was the cause of her engagement breaking off on the eve of her wedding. The famous ballerina Anna Pavlova was also one of his lovers. Princess Catherine Radziwill, whose family would become wrapped up with the Kennedys, called him the terror of jealous husbands as well as of watchful mothers. His trips abroad became legendary, his escapades in doubtful taste. He drank in the company of frauds and prostitutes. By 1901, Grand Duke Boris, aged 25, had a liaison with a French woman, Jeanne Alma Lacroix, and had a son by her, born in Paris. He remarked to his brother Cyril, whom he would watch nearly drown from the sinking ship Petropavlovsk, "After a while, every woman is the same. Nothing is new except the face." Upon his visit to America and his introduction to President Roosevelt, the president's daughter Edith made sure not to be present, stating Boris's presence was an insult and a scandal. In 1905, in Nice, Grand Duke Boris proposed to Princess Victoria Eugenia of Battenberg, but she forgot about him when she met her future husband, King Alfonso XIII of Spain, the next year. During the First World War, Grand Duke Boris gave many parties at his luxurious mansion, furnished in the English style, which should have impressed the Empress, but obviously didn't, due to Grand Duke Boris's proclivities. The mansion at night was a gathering place for the so-called golden youth of St. Petersburg, that generation that was crushed in World War I. The Grand Duke was famous for his hospitality, cheerful disposition, passion for entertainment, gourmet cuisine, and excellent wines. Years prior to this time, tutor Pierre Gilliard noted Grand Duchess Olga disappointed him in her studies. What was the disappointment exactly? Was Grand Duchess Olga expected to unite Russian society, or perhaps rise to a high social position, competing with her own mother, who had all but withdrawn from popular Russian court? The position of Grand Duke Boris's mother is important. The marriage refusal provoked her enmity, and the enmity of her entire circle. Maria Pavlovna the Older and her family were called the Vladimirovichi, and they plotted to depose Tsar Nicholas II and gain power themselves after the 1916 refusal. Towards the end of the monarchy, they were involved in a conspiracy to put Boris's brother Cyril on the throne. So perhaps the gentle Countess Hendrikova was a necessary buffer against all this drama. Grand Duke Boris was one of the few members of the Romanov family who traveled to Mogilev to pay final respects to his king. He also joined the royal family in house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo in 1917, but he had his arrest lifted in July 1917. He was then able to gain entrance to the Vladimir Palace. Disguised with the help of Englishman Albert Stopford and a caretaker, Boris retrieved family money and jewels from a secret safe in his mother's bedroom. Stopford took the jewels to safety abroad, depositing them in a London bank, including the Vladimir family's world-famous emeralds. The Bolshevik commander sent to execute Boris's brother and Boris in 1918 had once been a struggling artist in Paris, and Boris had actually helped him by buying some of his paintings. Such connection was how Boris escaped the Caucasus alive, an interesting turn in how the aristocracy, by helping struggling artists, ended up saving their lives. The Empress, the Grand Duchesses, and the courtiers loved Countess Hendrikova for her kindness, affability, meekness, simplicity, and openness in communication. She did not believe in Rasputin's saintliness, but this was no impediment to her service at court. Empress Alexandra gently tried to persuade her of Rasputin's merits, but dropped the topic permanently when it became obvious Hendrikova disagreed. You can learn more about Rasputin, his fans, and detractors on this channel. Mother Domnika's paper on Countess Anastasia Hendrikova was presented in 2020. Here is an excerpt. This gentle, fragile girl with a childish face, who seemed so weak, possessed the soul of a heroine. Many believe the only feat of Countess Hendrikova was she voluntarily followed the imperial family into exile. But her whole life was a feat. During her short life, she tried to bring joy and comfort to those around her, despite the fact she endured many sorrows. She wrote about it this way. A thought shared with me by the Empress today touched my soul deeply, that I may use the experience of suffering the Lord has sent me for the joy and comfort of others. Perhaps this is the purpose assigned to me by God. Countess Hendrikova began to perform this feat in childhood, when her mother, Sophia Petrovna, after a complex operation, was left bedridden. The Countess cared for her invalid mother for the next 20 years, selflessly devoting all her free time. Not only did she look after her, but she was a cheerful giver, and forgot about her own needs. Countess Hendrikova adhered to the words spoken to her by the Empress. Be merry and give her all the warmth of your love, bright face, despite the suffering of your poor soul. At a time when many of her peers led the carefree life of aristocratic women in the capital, year after year she followed the narrow path of selfless service to her mother. The grief of many years gradually nurtured her faith, strengthened her prayers, and made her able to live for others. Although Nastenka belonged to high society, she led the simplest way of life, distinguished by modesty. Raised under the strict rules of her mother, she maintained her purity. According to the memoirs of Sergei Smirnov, secretary of the Serbian princess Elena Petrovna, Countess Hendrikova often visited the Church of the 12 Apostles, located not far from her home. Smirnov also remarked on her funny walk, a potential reference to some injury. 2 zealous priests served in the 12 Apostles, first Archpriest Mikhail Gorchakov, then Archpriest Arkady Vinogradov, talented preachers. They spiritually nourished young Nastenka, providing her with good advice, helping her in her faith, and patience to bear the ordeal in her home. In 1910, she became a maid of honor to the Empress. The imperial family fell in love with her openness of soul, kindness, and sincere desire to bring joy to others. Everyone affectionately called her Nastenka. Captain Nikolai Sablin recalled how on one trip on the imperial yacht Standard, the Empress was sad due to her son's hemophilia, and Countess Hendrikova did her best to console her. Nastenka herself only had just experienced her own grief. Her father, Count Alexandrovich, died of a heart attack. But despite this, Countess Hendrikova brought a stream of liveliness and vigor into the life of those around her. The Empress told her, "You are the sun for all your darlings." Nastenka's sister, nicknamed Inochka, had tuberculosis. The 2 sisters were all the world to each other, wrote her fellow lady-in-waiting, Baroness Sophie von Buxhoveden, recalling how Nastenka's dark eyes glowed when she heard any news about her sister. And it was from Inochka's bedside that Nastenka rushed back to Tsarskoye Selo on the news of the revolution to join the Empress in her danger. A few hours after she arrived at the Alexander Palace, the former imperial residence became a prison for all who voluntarily wished to remain in it. That evening, she wrote in her diary gratefully, "Thank God I managed to arrive on time to be with them." Her presence was a great support for the royal prisoners. Always happy, meek, smiling, she cheered everyone up. In photographs from house arrest, she is pictured smiling. Some believe Countess Hendrikova returned to Tsarskoye Selo only out of duty or from her sense of devotion to the imperial family. But a close acquaintance of the family wrote, Countess Hendrikova was a person of deep, not superficial faith. From early childhood before her eyes were living examples of piety. Faith was the basis of her life and that of her family. Anastasia followed the imperial family quite consciously for the sake of God's commandments, realizing suffering and death awaited her. The Tsar was one of God's servants on earth, Russia's little father. This is evidenced by the entry in her diary made before leaving for Tobolsk. I surrender myself entirely into the hands of God with trust and love, and I know the Lord will support me during trials and in the moment of death. Countess Hendrikova grew up in an atmosphere of reverent reverence for Father John of Kronstadt. It is known the Hendrikovs turned to him with a request for prayer. In response, the pastor wrote them a letter, which the Countess carefully kept until the end of her days. Countess Hendrikova followed the Romanov family into exile, going with them first to Tobolsk and later to Ekaterinburg, even though she was worried about her own sister. At Tobolsk, one can see her looking at Grand Duchess Tatiana, perhaps wondering if there was a plot to escape, which you can learn about on this channel. In 1917, before leaving with the Tsar's family to Tobolsk, she wrote in her diary, I cannot leave here without thanking God for this wonderful world and the power he sent me and supported me during these 5 months of house arrest. The harder and harder my life becomes, I feel a greater spiritual peace. I realize now this is the best, the greatest happiness, and that everything can be endured, and I bless God. I experienced for myself, as the sufferings of Christ manifest within us, Christ will strengthen our consolation. If God sends me more trials and difficulties, then he will give me more strength accordingly. You just need to ask him for the Holy Spirit and strength for the day ahead. Her notes and diary testify to the depth of her spiritual experience. Her diary is filled with reflections like, I see your palace, my Savior, adorned. I do not yet have clothes to enter it. Much has to be changed in myself in order to enlighten the garment of my soul. But may the Lord do this, and I will accept from him with gratitude all the trials that he will send to me, firmly believing they will enlighten the garment of my soul. She realized not by her own strength, but only by the grace of God, a person can perform virtues. She constantly turned to God with faith and hope for his help. She wrote, I know I am nothing without the help of God. Despondency, fear, cowardice take possession of me as soon as God's grace leaves me. But I know it must be at times that this is a necessary test, which you must try to humbly and patiently endure. And then again bright moments appear, and I wait for them, and so I believe they will come. I had so many of them. I know this is only God's mercy, not according to my merits. When Baroness Sophie Buxhoveden met Nastenka in Tobolsk, she said of her, Nastenka said openly to me she had a premonition that all our days were numbered. She personally had gone through much sorrow that year. She was passionately devoted to the Empress, and the long months of captivity had tried her to the utmost and developed intensely the religious side of her nature. Indeed, she now lived an entirely spiritual life, and so fixed her thoughts on approaching death, it had no terror for her. She was very pretty and looked younger than her 28 years, but she welcomed the thought of death, so weary had she become of life, and so detached from earthly interests. I felt her drifting away to higher planes. As can be seen from the Countess's diary, in Tobolsk she did not miss a single opportunity to go to church, prayed with the Tsar's family, and faithfully attended all services held in the governor's house. During the Great Lent of 1918, she received communion twice, during the first week together with the imperial family, and on Great Thursday, after the departure of the Tsar and Tsarina to Ekaterinburg. In May 1918, Countess Hendrikova traveled with the rest of the Tsar's family to Ekaterinburg, but she was not allowed into a Patiev house. Instead, she was imprisoned. In July 1918, after the murder of the Tsar's family, the Countess was transported to the Perm prison, located on the outskirts of the city. In prison, Nastenka still tried to comfort others. Sometimes she even sang to support Princess Elena, who was imprisoned in the same cell with her. Elena was the wife of the prince of the imperial blood, Ion Konstantinovich, who had been murdered in Alapavsk along with Grand Duchess Ella, whom you can learn about on this channel, and other members of the imperial family. Sergei Smirnov, the secretary of the princess, recalled, Nastenka, with her joyful smile, supported the good state of the mind of Elena Petrovna, a very nervous nature, and experienced so many difficult hours. All the time I remember Nastenka's charming smile, her friendliness. Countess Hendrikova remained courageous until the final minutes of her life. On September 4th, 1918, she was taken from prison, ostensibly to be transferred. She realized she was being led to her death, but remained calm and warmly said goodbye to the Serbian princess. In her diary, she wrote the following prophetic words, If death awaits me, I am not afraid. I have much more there than here. I will finally be at home, in eternal bliss and peace. Earlier the doors to eternal life were closed to me. They are terrible, but now I feel them closer, open, just as clearly as you see the royal doors in the church open on Holy Easter week. That September day, Hendrikova and Madame Schneider were taken from their prison cell and led to the prison office, along with Alexei Volkov, a 60-year-old valet in the household of the Tsar. They were joined by 8 other prisoners, including the chambermaid from the house where Grand Duke Michael had lived. They had an escort of 22 guards, none of them Russian, and many of them Zionist Jews. Volkov, who later escaped, recalled when he asked a guard where they were being taken, he was told they were being taken to the house of arrest. Hendrikova, who had been in the washroom, asked a guard the same question. She was told they were being taken to the central prison. Hendrikova then asked, and from there? The guard replied, well, to Moscow. Hendrikova repeated this conversation to her fellow prisoners and made the sign of the cross with her fingers. Volkov took her gesture to mean, they will not shoot us. The sailor at the prison office door kept checking the front door that led to the street to make sure it was empty. After a while, another sailor said, let's go. They lined the prisoners up in the street in rows of 2, the men in front and the women in the back. The group walked all the way to the edge of town and onto the Simbursk road outside of Perm. Volkov asked another prisoner where the central prison was, and was told they had long passed it. Volkov realized they were being taken into the woods to be shot. He broke from the group and ran for his life. A bullet whizzed past his ear. Behind him he heard gunshots as the other prisoners in the group, among them Hendrikova, were shot and killed. The Red Guards did not waste a single bullet for the murder of the young woman. They shattered her skull with rifle butts. She was 31. The bodies of Hendrikova and Schneider were recovered by the White Army, which included many aristocrats, in May 1919. They were reburied in the Yagoshika cemetery, with a photograph taken of their graves for future reference. However, their graves were destroyed when the Bolsheviks regained control of the city, and the fate of Hendrikova's corpse remains unknown. She was canonized as a martyr by the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia in 1981. In October 2012, thanks to the efforts of a group of parishioners from churches in Moscow, and with the blessing of the Metropolitan of Perm and Solikamsky Methodists, a new cross was built at the site where Hendrikova and Schneider's remains were believed to have initially been buried. A memorial service with prayer is performed for Hendrikova and Schneider every year on the 4th of September at the burial site in the Yogashika Cemetery, which is situated near the Church of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Perm.